Awesome. So I welcome up the first affirmative speaker to start the team's case. Someone who lives without clean water, adequate money for food, and safe housing. The idea of the government spending millions of dollars and 10 years of resources on a claim for historical injustice that they will never see the benefits of is absolutely ridiculous. We are going to prove to you today that we improve living standards for marginalised groups to a large amount of people, and that's how we're going to win this debate. Couple arguments for this. Firstly, why the material reality is most important to these people and why that is more important than these historical injustices. And secondly, why the government is uniquely best placed to provide this aid on our side of the house. Okay, couple things to establish to start off. Firstly, why remedying these historical injustices comes a lot of time at the expense of reducing these inequalities. Firstly, this is government money that is going to these resources that could be redirected. This isn't just the money that's given out in claims, it's like 10 years of salary and resources to resolve a single claim. It's also the level to which the government feels like they need to do something, right? If they do something or like provide like a claim or some remedy of a historical injustice, they now feel like they don't have to do something to improve the current inequality, and also this reduces the public pressure on them to do something about this current inequality. So that's why it always comes at the expense of reducing these current inequalities, both money, political incentive, and resources. Okay, I'll now begin my first substantive about why to these people the material reality is the most important thing to them. Okay, under the status quo, there are people in post-colonial countries living in this abject poverty, right? We know this. This looks like a lot of Māori communities in Aotearoa. This looks like Indigenous people in the United States. This looks like African-American people and Aboriginal people in Australia. They are living in this way because of this post-colonial impact that colonisation has had on them. So why do these people care so much about the material reality, right? When you are struggling so much that you don't have drinking water, you can't go outside feeling safe in your neighborhood, you don't have enough water or food, or maybe you're not getting paid enough, maybe your benefit for your working for families is so small that you don't know how you are going to send your children to school in clothes, your top priority becomes surviving, getting better living conditions, and getting through the week. That is the thing that you care about the most because it is the thing that is having the biggest impact on you. From there, the thing that you care about in the more long term, it's getting your children through school. It is getting adequate healthcare for you in a system and society that does not currently provide it. That is your top incentive, and that's why you care the most about your material reality, because it is something that is so hard for you every single day to get through. The idea of a historical injustice is so removed from your life, and that's my second mechanism here. Okay. Why is this more important to that individual person than these historical injustices? Firstly, is to establish about these remedies for historical injustices. They only usually benefit like one structure within that community who is having this historical, who is having this like recognition put upon them. This looks like one iwi in New Zealand getting this claim back, one reservation in the Native American community getting this remedy. This means that for your average person who is affected by colonisation and by these existing inequalities, they see no benefit and no change from this remedy. This means that they do not care about it as much as they care about this material reality, because it is very unlikely to impact them. Even if it does impact the iwi, they are not likely, the trickle-down effect from that likely means that they don't see sort of improved material benefit, because when the government provides benefit, it is systemic. It is a systemic benefit within like either the education system, within employment situations, and things like that. Okay, so we know now that this is not as important to you. I'll take the point in a second, sorry. As your material reality, because it is such a struggle, and also because you are unlikely to see these benefits. Okay, so what do we know at the end of this? That this is really, really important to our case, because we can win by proving that these people actually, what they know is going to benefit them more is getting these existing inequalities, the things that impact them every day, improved, because this is only likely to benefit a very tiny microcosm of society, and in a way that is not as good as when the government provides this remedy, which I'll explain in my second substantive, but I'll take a point now.
Do you not concede that, like, by focusing on inequality more and just pouring all this money into it, you're just exacerbating the harmful stigmatization on these minorities because they're seen as just like sucking from the government?
Absolutely not. We think that what is seen more by that as public perception is the kind of historical injustice claims but we don't even think it's that important if some people think that about benefits and education systems and stuff like that. We think they're likely to think that more if they're seeing it as some historical injustice that happened 100 years ago. But even if they think that about this benefit and inequality, not that important to our case because we still get the benefits. In any case, public perception is worse on their side when they said that the government is giving money for something that happened 100 years ago and it's not going to do anything materially. So that really doesn't matter. Okay, why is the government best placed to give aid and why is that unique to when we pour these resources into this? This is really important to prove that we get those living conditions. Firstly, as I sort of briefly touched on, the government reach is significantly wider than what can happen for a community when an iwi or a reservation gets this money. This is because a lot of people in New Zealand, or for example, are disconnected from iwi or a lot of Native Americans will be disconnected from reservations due to colonisation, right? You may not even have a connection with an iwi. And again, that iwi is probably not likely to be the one who is getting those benefits. This means that when the government puts this benefit in, it is obviously, as I said, a systemic benefit, right? It is something that is going to change the system to make the system more equal for future generations and you as well. It's not just some sort of payout that removes the government of any accountability to actually changing this racist system. On the comparative, when it's given to obviously an iwi or a reservation or something like that, not everyone gets it, right? This is not likely to be put into actually changing the society that made these injustices necessary to be repaid, and it doesn't really go that far into improving the whole structure of society. Secondly, the government is best placed to give aid through infrastructure when they can put this money into aiding these communities rather than giving payouts and apologies, which are likely, as I've said before, to just be tokenistic to remove public pressure on the government. This is because these communities often have direct infrastructural needs, right? There are reservations in America where they do not have clean drinking water in 2021. The government is uniquely placed best to remedy this issue and other issues similar to that because they have unique access to resources, to money, to contracts where they can come in and actually remedy that issue, giving a massive payout to that reservation and hoping that they have the infrastructure set up to work out on their own how to get the best contract, how to do this without financially crippling themselves, and getting a better living conditions for their people is not good enough, and the government needs to take accountability rather than just giving payouts. Okay, so at the end of this point, what's clear is that the government is uniquely best placed to give aid because they have a wider reach and they can put this benefit upon a greater amount of people. Secondly, we know that they are better placed to do it because they have the infrastructure that these iwi are not, that these iwi and different reservations simply don't have. Also, that the material reality of these groups are far more important to them than some abstract concept of a historical injustice that they can't see has any current meaning in their lives and that they are very, very unlikely to benefit from anyway.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now we'll come up with the first speaker from the Wellington team.
When the government blinds itself to the centuries of struggle by communities who have fought in wars to get equal voice, education and access, because that's now endemic to the housing crisis and not the violent colonisation of your country, you fail to address the root of the issues structural to that nation and facilitate the cycle of these harms. What's our model and stance in today's debate? We think that rectifying historical justice looks like at a low level, leaders officially apologising and financially compensating for egregious acts, or on a large scale, this looks like returning land to Māori iwi, this looks like building memorials and increasing goals for representation for historically oppressed minorities. We'd always favoured these goals over current inequality, but we think that we'd significantly achieve current inequality as well. We don't have to erase them. We're happy to get policy policy on housing markets across, etc., but we think that it's far more important that we prioritise things like Mariah's built on alienated Maori land. In our debate today, at best we get legislative change, and at worst we get social change. Three main substantive points in the debate today. Firstly, how we perpetuate harmful cycles. Secondly, how we disable minorities. And then a split, Richard, at second, on how we get better engagement on our side of the house. I'd first like to make 4 quick points of rebuttal. So just firstly, for the person who has no clear water or access to housing, we tell you policies such as regulating the housing markets doesn't actually acknowledge the colonisation of Maoris and how they've been completely lost their sense of identity. They've completely been ignored for entering professional workplaces or pursuing higher education because you have a history that tells you that because of the colour of your skin, you haven't been victorious in history and battle. That's something you get when the government makes a clear decision to return your land back or financially compensate you. That has a massive impact, not only in your lifetime, but also for your children and for your grandchildren as well, to enter a society where racism hasn't been legitimatized. Secondly, on material impacts, I'm going to address firstly why I think we still get material benefits, but here's why the social change is actually really important. Look, you can get all the policy you want, but if your employer still believes that Māori are sucking payments off the government, that's really harmful for promotion and workplace relations. I'll tell you why we actually get targeted systemic change, but we tell you that it's actually really important to get cultural and social change if we want to get any traction behind legislation. Thirdly, on tokenism, we just tell you that happens on both sides of the house, but even at our best, we actually delegitimize racist rhetoric if we have legitimate bodies, such as Jacinda Ardern, telling you that your racist claims that Māori have been savages throughout history are incredibly unfounded. It's far easier to call these people out and just dismiss them off rather than telling them that because it hasn't been recognised, it largely still stands. So this is my first substantive point, how we perpetuate harmful cycles. Because note that historical justices are very ingrained in society today and are a product of the failure to adequately respond to them at the time. We showed that current inequalities are so damaging for 4 main reasons. First of all, we don't think it's surprising at all that current obesity has affected predominantly Māori and Pacifica people because they've been systemically subjugated to lower income, they're more likely to be racially targeted, have physically bad livelihoods and employment, all because of the systemic injustices that have occurred to them in antiquity. Putting a sugar tax is going to be really harmful to actually getting to the root of the systemic issues. We think it's far better on our side of the house to compensate Māori families financially, give them the ability to be able to afford education, provide better housing, etc. That's actually where you get change. But secondly, we think the systemic equality is really arbitrary to fix policy. When you provide more state housing, just completely ignore the nuances of why Māori were put in the position in the first place. We tell you that policy looks great for politicians in wider society, but if you're a young Native American, and although you've been given a more stable economy, you've never changed the perception of your future employees that your ancestors weren't brutally crippling the US forces because the government has never acknowledged that, and therefore people can't engage. We tell the short-term economic goals are very dangerous when you don't get the cultural and social change to at least acknowledge that your people have acknowledged it. Yeah, I'll take a bit why.
To get to the root of systemic issues, surely it's better to change the system through addressing inequality rather than providing a payout?
Yeah, no, we're happy to stand for that. We tell you, we told you this looks like government's calling out. Literally, Emmanuel Macron recently recognised in the Rwanda genocide that France failed to adequately respond. We tell one branch of this is legislator. We tell you it's far more easy for politicians to call out the root of systemic issues. I just told you that my substantive point. Let's look at why it's effective when government's called out. Because when you get a figure of credibility, constantly wide reported on a national global scale, when people say something such as Jacinda Ardern, such as Emmanuel Macron, people will respond and engage to that. We just tell you that's so important to give a platform to initiate change when you recognise that. Because when these groups speak out, they get more legitimacy because suddenly the Prime Minister of your nation has recognised them. That's where you get action because their plight has now been signalled. It's really important. But fourthly, we just tell you it's cohesively really important to disenfranchise dangerous rhetoric. Know that they just completely misconstrue this on their side of houses, tell you cultural norms weren't really important. Look, we're not probably going to get rid of racism, but it's far easier to shut down, like Ekelon's a group telling that Māori have just completely disabolished the social welfare system, if Jacinda Ardern explains to you how the oppression of Māori colonisation has forced them to have no other alternative than to turn to winds. Even if we can't change opinion, we still get the public recognising that that's really illegitimate and unfounded. That's really important to not actively perpetrate the historical oppression that they live their eyes by. What are the impacts of this? 2 reasons. Firstly, we get the advancement for historical justice, not only by the government, but giving these social justice groups more credibility and recognition. That's really important to give them a platform, to get things like better workplace relationships, for getting and encouraging employment and education with minority groups. Secondly, we don't risk an erasure of history, because the narrative of what history expects is no longer dictated by whether the government thinks it's okay to say it or not. We actually force their hand to educate people to be more sensitive and aware, and to not give fuel to damaging rhetoric and relations. That's so important, because we think these short-term gains from side A ignore the long-term causes. We don't think we can get any benefit to sort of painting over the dye of systemic issues that will always bleed through if it's never addressed. Secondly, let's look at my second substantive disengagement. We take that governments don't currently have a massive incentive, because that's admitting that they've pretty much committed genocide in the past. That's really damaging for 2 reasons. Firstly, you disenfranchise minorities because they're not seen as legitimate, as I told you. That looks like them not wanting to engage in votership or in civic duty because they don't want to endorse a system that has actively ignored them. Secondly, you get really important deteriorating trust. That's really important, because when you don't acknowledge the core of your being, of your sovereignty and your human rights, you're never going to engage in a policy that or in any sort of balanced dialogue and cohesion when you're shutting out millions of voices. So we tell you that it's so important when people come out and apologise, bestow a massive sense of empowerment and recognition that gives you the social and cultural agency to act on systemic issues. So proud to oppose.
Thank the speaker for their speech, and welcome up the second speaker of the affirmative team.
It was ridiculous for CNI to come out and say that these marginalised communities are not going to go ahead and vote because they feel like the government is not representing to them, when we clearly told you on our side that these marginalised groups feel like they're not supported when they don't have clean water, when they can't feed their children, when they can't just do basic necessities everyone can do, because they have had this historic racism that has gone into this general system, and that we are changing through adapting current structures to benefit them. That is what we are doing today. We are changing these structures to help these marginalised groups. That is how we win in today's debate. 2 points I'm going to bring to you today. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about why marginalised communities would rather the government take action that is relevant to them today. And secondly, I'm going to talk about why the government is better able to aid these marginalised communities on our side, compared to, for example, giving compensation to iwis and Moraks. Firstly, on why marginalised communities would rather the government take action that is relevant to them today. Firstly, I'd just like to clarify that both sides are addressing the same community and problem, because often we're looking at Māori and Aboriginals, and we know that historic injustice has had an impact on them to today. So what we think is effective is addressing today's issues, and therefore we can fix these historic wrongs through doing that. Therefore, it looks like things like injustice is led to, like, example is like there was injustice that led to Aboriginals being more likely to be unemployed. The best way to suit that and affect that is to have a direct response by increasing the benefit. That is what we do today. We have a direct response on our side. So these people have happier lives, which is realistically what they want in today's debate. What have we heard from side neg then? Firstly, they said that our side doesn't get the apology and therefore we don't address the issue. Two responses to this. Firstly, we'd say that on our side, we actually do to some extent get recognition of the injustice. And this is because the government is putting like money, for example, in state housing to help poor areas. That means they have to use statistics to look at like the income of people in these areas, the racial groups of these areas. When they do this research, they're going to find out Māori people are more poor in these areas and it's more common. It makes them question, why is this? The effect leads them to know this is due to colonisation, and therefore they have to address the fact that they now have to help Māori people in terms of state housing because they are poorer, and therefore we're actually addressing that issue. But secondly, we'd say to this point that we realise that even though we don't get this direct apology on our side, we admit we don't have that, we still think we would rather have like these marginalised groups get things like water, healthcare, things that they need immediately in their life that we think has an impact, like heating on your Aboriginal family, being able to pay for your kid to go into school. These are things that have direct impacts you really care about and that you want to have addressed. So what do we do today? We think that at the end of this, we think that the reason for an apology to be given is so that someone can have a better life and feel happier and more content in life. We actually do this more on our side because when we provide these people with things like better healthcare, they have a more fulfilling and happy life and they feel more secure in their social circumstance. Secondly, then, what they told us is this point on cultural change. And they talked about how on our side we have stigmas, and secondly, on how we still don't get social change on our side. Firstly, addressing the stigma point. So basically, firstly, we'd say to this that we're actually more likely to have stigma on their side. And that's because when you have money that directly goes to an iwi, there's more likely to be racism going, oh, the Māori people are just sucking $6 million out of the government. That is the issue we have on their side. Whereas with us, yes, we have it going towards the benefit, and yes, we agree that would be a high proportion of Māori people because they tend to be more unemployed due to colonisation. But we also have people on our side like Pākehā, other ethnic groups who are unemployed that we help additionally. Therefore, because we don't only cater for Māori, we're less likely to get this stigma and this idea that these marginalised communities are sucking away money on our side. So at the end of this, we think that they won't actually have as much stigma on our side. Finally, then, under this point on social change in response to that, basically we say that they said that we don't get social change, but we think that we clearly change structures, and that is how we get social change. For example, when the government realises that we have a high proportion of Māori with health issues, and we put in a Māori health board, we are getting social change and showing that we are changing to improve the Māori lives of these Māori people. But also it ensures that the government has to recognise that their current system isn't working. They have to recognise that their current system was either racist or inherently biased to a particular group. And therefore we think that does create social change because they have to think about it and change it because they want the betterment of society. Finally, at the end of this point, what we recognise is that the harm that Ned brings to us about how these people feel like they aren't advantaged in society and that they won't vote and all that because of that, what we realise is these people rather just care about things like clean water. We bring that on our side. We are happy for that. Secondly, then, let's talk about how the government is ignoring history. Look, we still, again, this is just repetition, we still get acknowledgement on our side because the government is putting in infrastructure and saying the system is an issue. Finally, then, at the end of this point, we are able to recognise that these people in marginalised groups would rather have action that is more relevant to their everyday lives so they can live everyday activities, not have to worry about their health, not to worry about their kids' future, that ponders on many adults' lives and is very important to their everyday livelihood. That is the difference compared to something like memorial apologies and like land that sometimes these people don't even have. Second point then on why the government is better able to aid the marginalised communities on our side. We would like to clearly say that SIGNEG has not addressed any of our material about our second point from my first speaker. We told you clearly that the government is able to reach a wider range of people on our side. We told you that just happens through, for example, when you increase the benefit, you help Māori people, but you also help a few extra people who are Pākehā, for example.
Okay.
What we told you that happens on their side, actually I'll take you in a minute, is that the iwi, like sometimes people in iwis, they lost their iwi due to colonisation, and therefore they don't have any connection to their iwi, and they're not benefiting from it, even though they are Māori people, even though they are disadvantaged. That is the difference in today's side of the house. I'll take it quickly.
Okay. Considering things like the state benefit, how many people in wider society really think that A, that's an adequate response to like the genocide of Māori communities in the past, or B, that it's like actively helping, like, or that it's not just going directly to Māori communities, then there's like small percentage of Pākehā.
Well, it is going directly to Māori people because majority of people on the benefit are Māori, and so therefore they are advantaging from this. That is what we bring to you. Finally, let's quickly told you some of the other benefits we said. We said the government is held more accountable because they have to hold up to statistics in the general population to show that when they put money into the benefit, they are actually decreasing the amount of unemployment, decreasing these effects. Therefore, we show to you that we get change in unemployment in that aspect for people like Māori communities, for people like Aboriginals. That is the change we have. With iwis, once you give that $6 million to them, they are completely held responsible for it. The government doesn't check back in because it's their money. They are able to allocate and decide what they want to do with it. So therefore, sometimes the projects they might put it in aren't the most beneficial for these Māori groups or for these Aboriginal groups. Our side, we ensure that the money is always going to be useful to these groups to ensure that we actually change and improve the current social situation. Finally, then, we told you that iwis don't have infrastructure to support things like giving Māori schools and like improving their like scholarships and stuff. That is an issue we have in today's debate. So proud to stand for this motion.
Thank you for their speech. And now the second speaker is on the game.
I just want to reiterate the fact that minorities suffer so many things as a result of historical injustice. And I will be further discussing how that there will be better engagement under our side of the house in my split. But first I'll rebut with two questions surrounding these points of clash. So we see the first of what will the government do, right? The second is how does this affect people/minorities? So beginning on what will the government do? They kind of came out in their first speaker and said like, the government doesn't feel like they don't have to do something because they can just apologize. But like this just isn't inherently true to this motion because it's a misclarification because the motion actually states it is actually funding. So this isn't just apologies, right? The government is still putting funding. It's not just apologizing to these Māori groups, it's apologizing through funding. They also talked about how the government is best placed to give out this money. Yes, under our side of the house, we still see the government giving out this, and yes, we would see this going again to iwis, but iwis can provide things like a community garden, which have like a continuous cycle effect, rather than giving to one person who is so in need that they want to clarify, is so in need that they put direct money into their child's clothing, which is now gone, right? So it's not a continuous money flow. They also talked about how the government will just give payouts, but that's more likely to happen under their side when the government is just paying to help in the short term and not providing adequate long-term benefits, like improving the view of minorities, which I will clarify on later. They also talked about how we'll reach a wider group, but they wrongfully characterize this as money going to one iwi, right? And this is just not true. It is like the government, for example, like returning land. It is just more than one iwi who reach an actual wide community. They also talked about how iwis can't make these good decisions, which is just like inherently not true, right? They're more likely to make better decisions than individuals, right? If you've got 1,000 individuals and you've got a section of iwis, they're more likely to make decisions better at a better percentage than this
wide range of people on the benefit. So kind of moving on to how does this affect people/minorities? Because, okay, they kind of talked about how like this post-colonial reality, like they agree that this is because of historical results. But when we improve like systemic engraved ideals in society, these people are least likely to be discriminated against. And like I will touch on that in my split. Like they talked about like they just want adequate healthcare, but what about the ideals engraved in public service workers, right? Who work in the public sector and we could be seeing these people as tax leechers, right? They're taking my money that they work in the public sector. And just again on like the one iwi getting the claim, like we just see a wider benefit, and we just see that iwis aren't going to push away Māoris who like may not have any other places to go. Like they are still a community. Māori is a very big community. They're not segregated into like saying no, you can't like come and benefit from what the government has given us. And so they also talked about the best way to unemployment is to increase the benefit. But when you don't actually acknowledge the system, that means they aren't employed. It will never get a full-scale change. If you're not actually addressing the issue, you're just throwing money at it, you're not going to get a better overall employment rate. It just does not happen. And they didn't respond to the point where we delegitimize racist rhetoric when we show that like people don't have a legitimate reason now to be racist because they are looking at people and actually realizing why they need this money. They're not going, oh, these people are poor, maybe they're just lazy. They're saying, oh, they've actually faced these systemic issues, right? So, okay, maybe we need to address that. And then in the long run, it's just a flow-on effect and it actually benefits. And like, just this whole point, they didn't respond to it. And like, when they said they'd still support Pakeha because we had Pakeha on the benefit, right? We still, like, then they agreed, right, that Māori are the majority of the benefit. And we just think that this, like, short-term effect of giving people this money that they can't use, right? They talked about it needs to go to their kids, right? Of course, like, it will go to their kids, right? And their kids are going to need more clothes and more clothes and more clothes. But when we fix the issue of unemployment, then maybe they can get a job and maybe they can like have a long-term effect of actually bringing in money. I will take your point.
How do you fix unemployment when you pay $1 million out to a specific iwi?
Well, that wasn't the point that we kind of gave up on. Like when we have a policy, right? The government looks at a policy, they can look like, and they can like have a policy surrounding these employment problems, then that can kind of like, if we saw, say maybe like having a quota for Māori in the employment like area, then we'd actually see Māori having more chance of being employed and just this roll-on effect. Whereas if you're just throwing money at it, it's not going to happen under your side of the house. So moving on to my point of how like these historic injustices will realistically improve engagement in the public. So we see two main reasons as to why this is true. We've seen one is an example of Native American history. Two is the ignorance versus engagement. So onto how Native Americans, like as a wider effect, will benefit as a result when we focus on historical injustices. So Native Americans, we all know, as prior to colonization, were the natives that had existed on land for centuries. We've seen so many injustice actions against them. For example, when they hear them being told to go back to where they came from and stating the absolute lack of recognition to their land's history, where the society has failed to recognise that, again, Thanksgiving wasn't actually a peaceful feast, but rather the celebration of European gain. So, outside of the house, when we support government putting funding into things like education or having memorials, which I just showed without this, we would continue these systemic issues within society, something that F just has to stand for. At our worst, we push discussion into a largely ignored area, right? While at F's best, they stick to a Band-Aid on a gaping wound by not addressing the systemic issues at hand. So this onto my second mechanism of how leading from the example of the Native African Indians, another reason as to why engagement improves, we see a difference in ignorance versus engagement. So when a society has no push to engage in minority issues or even address them, nothing systematically changes. We have proven this, and this is true as people don't see the cause to a lot of current inequalities, right? But rather label these minorities as things like tax leechers. So by supporting government to address historical issues and promise benefits, even at the worst, we still see racism, right? As stated by our first speaker, this is now largely unjustified, forcing facts into claims. Somebody now can't go out and say Māori are lazy because they don't have jobs. Like that, like it is a proven fact Māori have a higher unemployment rate. But now, once we realise that, okay, maybe because of the systemic injustice that they face for their whole life and their grandparents and their parents before that, okay, maybe now we can't make these claims that they're lazy and rather are just not benefited by the system. And so, on the affirmative side, we see little clear reason as to why the public would suddenly realise that untaught issues, and at their best, we see no long-term effect on the massive harm of lack of education, but a chance to throw money at a weeping wound. So impacts of this, right? When we look at the impacts of our case, we see a society with an engagement into issues as they are being influenced by the government. The government is the entirety of a system, right? So at our worst, we still see an opportunity to actually discuss fundamental historical events. On slide neg, we stand for an educated society. Proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and now welcome up the third speaker of the affirmative.
A community garden is never going to be as good at changing the system for Māori as education improvements, as employment improvements, and as healthcare policy is going to be. We don't want a sugar rush of short-term money going to a few select iwi. We want structural, long-term change that will actually benefit these marginalised groups in the future and actually change people's perspectives and give them better life outcomes. Two things I'm going to tell you today. Firstly, I'm going to tell you how we improve the conditions for these marginalised groups, and then I'm going to tell you how we still get this justice and how we reduce racism better on our side of the house. Okay, so firstly, how we improve the conditions for these marginalised groups. We told you from first that material reality is always going to be more important to these people. When these people, like people who live in Flint, Michigan, don't have clean water to drink from, that is always going to be more important than apologies for slavery. When people are not able to get jobs because of like structural reasons, that is always going to be more important than an apology for colonization, right? Or even an apology or even giving them their land back. That's never going to give them a job, right? We told you that. We told you that an average Māori person is not actually in this iwi group and not going to get extra money from this like $7 million payout that they give to an iwi group because of these reasons from colonization that mean that like people are disconnected, right? Like these Māori people find that they're like, or their parents were too embarrassed or were not allowed to be connected to their iwi. So then the average Māori person is not connected to their ancestors, right? So they don't even get this benefit. But on our side of the house, they get the benefit of improving education, right? They get the benefit of like actually being able to get Māori kids into tertiary education at the same rates that we can get Pākehā kids. We get lower incarceration rates for Māori people in New Zealand, and we get better healthcare for Māori people, which we saw with the Māori Health Authority. And that means that we get longer life expectancies equal to those of Pākehā, and we get better health rates, such as these issues of obesity, right? These things impact the most marginalized and the most vulnerable people of these marginalized groups, right? They impact the ones who are like at like the lowest point, right? They impact the ones who are like homeless, right? Because we see that marginalized groups like make up a disproportionate amount of homeless people. So we get improvements for those people. We get more actionable solutions, and we also get more accountability. Like we told you in first, we get it from the government, because the government can't just be like, well, we're sorry for like colonization and then think that they've addressed those issues, right? They have to actually put in the effort and put in the resources to take actionable action that provides good outcomes for these people. And we also get accountability from the public, because when white liberals see that the government has made an apology or given a group of people $7 million, they think it's enough, when it never will be, because these people face systematic issues that will never be fixed by a sugar rush, by a short-term injection of cash to these people. We need to dismantle these systems of oppression that hurt these people. What do we know at the end of this? We know that we are the best side at improving the material reality and the living conditions of these marginalized groups. This is so incredibly important, because like I've told you throughout my speech, it's like these lowest of the lowest people, right? They are struggling the most. They really need their help, our help, and we can't let them be sitting like this, right? And then, so how do we get this material reality change on SIDNEG? We accept that SIDNEG can put some of this money into this, right? It's not like exclusive that they can only do historical things. We accept that, but we tell you it's just like not as good on their side, right? Because if they want to give money to iwi in New Zealand, the issue is that iwi people don't have the infrastructure to make systemic changes, right? They don't have the infrastructure to be able to reform the police system so that Māori men are not do not make up half of our prison population, so that we do not have the highest rate of Indigenous women incarceration in the world, right? They don't have this infrastructure to get into those government programs and fix the racism that's in our healthcare system. If we gave $7 million to Māori iwi, they would not be able to set up a Māori health authority themselves. That is something that can only come through government change, right? So what do we know at the end of this? We know that on SIDNEG, they only are able to get a small amount of material change, and it's never going to be on the same level that we see on our side, because iwi can't make this infrastructure change, right? And then real quickly, I just want to touch on like these long-term conditions, because I've told you throughout that SIDNEG wants to insert like a sugar rush of cash into these people. We told you it's not going to work, and the long-term benefits are going to be doing this infrastructure so that people have equal opportunities and we have an equal New Zealand. This is really important. We just think that like we want people to have the best living conditions, right? Like whether we do reduce racism, at the end of the day, if like Māori people are not disproportionately homeless, that's like a massive benefit on our side, and we think that is the most important thing. But I'm going to go and tell you how we can still get justice on our side of the house and how we reduce this racism. So firstly, under this, how we still get this justice. I want to clarify, we are not erasing history, because we can still get a direct apology on our side of the house. Because when the government writes up that legislation that says, let's get a Māori health authority, they are actively acknowledging that there is an issue in Māori health infrastructure. That means that they have this like lower life expectancy, right? They are actively acknowledging that this issue is here by putting in these social programs that are directly targeted at the group. So what does this mean? This means that we can still get the apology that NEG also has, right? But we get it along with having these structural benefits to these people. So it ends up being more important, right? So what we heard from the negating side of the house is that there's going to be this idea that like Māori people are these tax leeches, that like there's going to be all of this racism because of this. But actually we see it as the complete opposite, right? Because we told you that this injection of cash doesn't fix these structural issues. And what that's going to mean is it's going to mean that Māori people are still homeless. Māori people are still disproportionately on the benefit. And at the end of the day, that's always going to mean they're seen more as tax leeches. Whereas on our side of the house, we fix those systemic issues so that we aren't disproportionately having Māori people on the benefit. And that means that that means that there's not this idea of tax leeches. We reduce this like racism, right? Because racism always happens in the prison. It is so much harder to be racist about things that are happening in the prison, right? It's easier to dismiss the past, because when someone says that like Māori people are like tax leeches, but on our side of the house we can say, but no, because we have these structural changes now, they're like equal, right? that means that they can't actually say that, right? Because the evidence is right there in front of them. But if we're only addressing it from the past and we still have the structural issues, like we see on Ned's side of the house, then that's like going to work, right? These racists will still be racist. And honestly, at worst, like there's going to be racism on both sides. Like that's just like New Zealand, right? It's always racist, it always sucks. Ned really has provided, like really under-mechanized this point about why we're going to get this racism. But we have told you that by improving their current conditions, people can look at Māori and see that they're equal, right? There's not going to be this kind of racism that we're here. Stand to rectify current issues rather than the past.
Thank the speech for their speech, and now welcome up the third speaker of the debate.
Like we told you at every speaker down our line, it doesn't matter if you float millions of dollars into social welfare, millions of dollars into state housing, you're never going to solve the root injustices that exist in our society today. All of the benefits they wanted to claim, things like the Māori Health Authority, recognise the Māori Health Authority was established because Māori were disproportionately excluded from healthcare for hundreds of years. This claim is literally ridiculous to say they're just going to completely lift all these Māori people and minority groups out of poverty. We don't think they get these benefits, and that's why they're going to lose this debate. Two clashes for the House today. Firstly, who materially improves the lives of minorities, and secondly, who has a more sustainable social change. So firstly, onto this point about who materially improves the lives of minorities. Note, we think this is extremely important material in the debate, because at the point we're able to improve the lives of minorities more than side affirmative in the long term, we're able to better enfranchise them, make them feel more welcome in society, and have them better. We think that's really, really important because they're such a vulnerable stakeholder in today's debate. What did they tell you then? They told you the government's going to be the best place to do this, which we agree with, by the way. And they're going to say they're going to improve the quality of life of these things. They're going to have a systemic benefit. There's infrastructure to place this, and they're going to have material benefits to these people, like clean water, that kind of thing. I have 4 key responses to this. Firstly, the policies never acknowledge the systemic injustice faced by these minorities. You're never going to have people feeling enfranchised, feeling welcome. They're always going to have higher rates of mental health, things like depression, that kind of thing. You can throw all the money at state housing and social welfare, but you never acknowledge the social injustices. We think that's so important. Secondly, poor minorities are never going to have a platform to actually raise up, go up the social ladder in society. Why is this? Because of stigma. So I'm going to address stigma now. They tried to tell you that they don't have minority stigma acting on them when the government acts. Firstly, we tell you on our side, we're never going to have that stigma that they wanted to talk about. When respected figures like Jacinda Ardern tell you that they're putting money into iwi, putting money into marae, which is a complete mischaracterization of our case, by the way. We told you we're putting funding into it as well. It's not mutually exclusive. You're never going to have that stigma, that racism that's been so prevalent in today's debate. Secondly, people are inherently selfish. We tell you the incentives acting on people are largely determined by income. Therefore, what does this mean? When high income workers, people like CEOs of companies, people like business owners are paying so much tax to subsidize these minority groups getting into social state housing, they're never going to be facilitating to employ them in the future. They're never going to give them work and actually have them rise up in the social hierarchy. We think that's so important because you can get people clean water all you want, but they're always going to be at the bottom of society, and they're never going to have a platform to raise themselves up in society. Thirdly, on either side, people are always going to have something to say about the policy and where money goes. We say we give more places to engage with things like war memorials, with things like developing marae.
Oh,
That's a long-term benefit that is exclusive to our side of the house. Even when you just pour money into poor people, you're not going to have that facilitating, like reducing racism. It's so much easier to knock over on our side of the house. Back to who materially improves the lives of minorities then. We tell you that when you have the stigma, they're not going to have a platform to raise themselves up in society. We think that's so important. Thirdly, poverty is just like a relative thing. Like you're always going to have people like trash collectors. You're always going to have people like cleaners. And we think that the minorities that they want to talk about are always going to be more likely to have these jobs and never get, never be able to like raise themselves up in businesses. But fourthly, we still think we totally have the capacity to claim all of the benefits they wanted to talk about, even if it's like 6 months later. We still think it's like worth waiting. We don't think it's okay that people don't have clean drinking water, but we think it's better that they wait for 6 months to get clean drinking water if it means they're not going to be completely oppressed and completely disadvantaged in their society for generations to come. They then wanted to tell us, we think that's just so important, because if you're like a Māori person under their side of the house, sure, you might have clean drinking water, but you have no sense of belonging. You're constantly judged, you're consistently given looks on the street, and you're systematically and institutionally locked out of employment and education. We don't think that's a desirable quality of life that we want for these minorities who are such a vulnerable stakeholder in today's debate. Yeah, I'll take a POI.
Oh yeah. So how do you actually propose that they get drinking water in 6 months' time when the funding is probably going to like a different group or a different iwi and there's no structural change?
Okay, we acknowledge that like there's still going to be more like people having to there's still going to be money going to things like historical injustices under our side of the house. But what we also say is that there's a limit to historical injustices. Like history has a limit. There's still injustices that take place, but at the point you're bettering more of them, you have less capacity to improve historical injustices because they just don't exist. So at that point, you have more money going to all the benefits you wanted to talk about, and all your benefits are not mutually exclusive at that point. Secondly, who has a more sustainable social change for minorities? They wanted to tell us, we told you that we have very damaging, harmful historical injustices, and we're going to get a social change when we do this. They had two responses to this. Firstly, they said they're just going to completely get this when you change the structures and like reduce the structural barriers. This quite frankly didn't respond to anything we said about our material, about the minority historical injustices, how they're going to feel so disenfranchised under their side of the house. Secondly, they just told us that governments are going to be able to change, yeah, I'll take it.
Okay. We told you how we still get apologies through recognition of historical injustices. And
yeah,
also
I'm about to get to
apologies
that. Hold on. Governments are going to get the change because they changed the system. Two responses to this. Firstly, they told us, firstly, we tell you it's often like the opposition party. We see this in cases like the Ihumato land occupation, where it was like the opposition party that committed the social injustice. You're never going to get this impactful social injustice when it was just like the other party that did it, so they just rectify it. We think this is more common and more prevalent in cases like the US when there's a very polarized society. But secondly, they gave us no clarification of how the government actually makes the social change. We think we've given you consistent analysis down our line how the stigma is exacerbated on their side of the house. They then told us that they get good apologies through the structural benefits. I'm sorry, but you're never going to be like more enfranchised as a minority if you're like given a few dollars or like given a state house, then when you actually acknowledge the systemic injustice that's been faced by your race, by your people for hundreds of years, and you actually put structural reasons in place to better them and actually commemorate them. We think that's so important. At the end of this debate, we materially improve the lives of minorities, a very vulnerable group in today's debate. We don't drag them down. We don't put them at a disadvantage in the long term for the rest of their lives. We're extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and as is traditional, we reverse the speaking order. So I'd now like to invite out the leader of the engagement team to give their response.
raising a state benefit was never going to be an adequate response to the genocide of communities throughout history, or fueling the rhetoric of casual and damaging racism because wider society was never forced to engage with the historic oppression of its minorities when its leaders never came out to public and acknowledged this. That's really, really harmful to get any of the benefits in the long term that they talked about. Sure, you might raise the benefit and get a few state housing, but this does nothing to the lineage of your daughters, of your grandchildren, of all these people like years down the track who are going to be victimized by the issues you never structurally solved. Two main points of clash in today's debate. Firstly, who benefits the lives of minorities, and secondly, who gets better structural change for society. So firstly, let's look at who benefits the lives of minorities. So both sides of the House agreed that like structural change was really important. The best way to doing this wasn't splashing money at surface level government policies, it was actually engaging in the reasons why they have to do this in the first place. Look, we think it's really important that people in Flint have access to clear water, but what we think is even more important is that they always have access to clear water and don't ever have to be in the position to beat their government again, because the government never addressed the fundamental structural issues as to why they were in that position in the first place. We tell you that's what happens under the Māori DHB, really personal example to us, whose inception was literally by recognizing that the Māori discussion was shut out by centuries of colonization and that they could never engage with political systems. We tell you that things like that we're happy to stand for on our side of the House, arise as a result of diagnosing really crucial structural roots of delegitimization, disenfranchisement. So on this as well, we just tell you that things, when we're looking at structural solutions, we're looking at things like Māori poverty, we're looking at things like economic disempowerment and disenfranchisement. That doesn't look like raising the benefit, because while that gets you short-term solutions, we tell you it's far better on our side of the House that we actually give land back to minorities. We actually give at worst, we just give empowerment and franchisement to minorities who recognise that the government's played an active role in their disempowerment. But we also just give far better mechanisms for these minorities to engage in the future to actually get any of these benefits. We tell you this looks like giving access to education to Māori people. We tell you that this looks like enabling systems in place for this to get this structural change. We tell you even if all of this fails and we don't get this legislation, things like empowerment by minorities, when Jacinda Ardern on the global stage admits that Māoris have been massively disenfranchised and genocides took place in the New Zealand War, that was really important for giving you a legitimate platform for people to buy into and also to defuel and deregulate racist rhetoric as a backlash. So let's look at our second point of clash, who gets better structural change. Most of this centered around racism, which I've always just kind of acknowledged. But we tell you, look, either side of the House is going to fix racism. But at the point when Biden acknowledges the suffering of Native Americans, that forces the public to actually engage with the reasons why people are in this position in the first place. Because otherwise, we just tell you statistical reports by housing ministers, look, that's maybe great for government. That was going to do nothing for your average person walking the street who thinks Māori people leech off the government. What we tell you is really important when we get news fears, circulating the information about the colonization of Māori people. We tell you that was never going to be a sugar fix that they wanted to characterize on our side of the House. We tell you that, look, we also just want to point out that most of their case just hinged on promoting funding for iwi. That was one thing we were happy to stand for, but we were also happy for promoting education, returning land ownership, things like Māori DHBs. We think that really that's a really big harm that they can see on their side of the House. We just want to note as well that on the structural change we get, our entire case, which is antithetical to this sugar fix, we tell you that when we diagnose underlying structural issues and we get better cohesion, that was far better on our side of the House than just improving arbitrary economic policy and housing regulation. We tell you it's far important to engage with this at a meta level to get granular benefits. So proud to oppose.
Thank you, Speaker, for their speech, and now welcome up the leader of the affirmative team to conclude the debate.
Throwing government money at a tiny microcosm of society at the expense of proper systematic change that delivers justice for future generations was never going to be enough for Neg to win today's debate. We showed you 3 clear things today. Firstly, we showed why marginalised groups would rather their material reality be improved. Secondly, we showed you how we address social injustices. And finally, we showed you why the government was better able to aid these marginalised communities than at the expense of the iwi doing it themselves. So what did we firstly show you? Why marginalised groups would rather their material reality improved. Basically, what we've told you throughout the line in today's debate is that a Māori person who is struggling to pay their rent will always rather to increase the benefit for their own purposes rather than something like a community garden. What did we hear from CNI? They said that iwi can provide things like community gardens, like scholars, statues in the community. But we told you that we can give so much more to these disadvantaged communities in today's debate. What else did we hear from CNI under this point? They told us that these groups would in fact rather an apology. But we told you that we get an apology on our side because the government has to admit that their old systems didn't work and it hurt this minority group and that they're changing for that reason. That is why we have the Māori Health Board, because originally it wasn't about colonisation. It was a board specifically set up to improve Māori health because it recognised that they significantly were worse. But then we recognised through it was due to colonisation. We only got that on our side because we looked at the health change and the current inequality. So at the end of this material point, we are able to realise that even if we don't get an apology, which we do, we think that people would rather have this better healthcare, better education, which we do for these minority groups who are inherently disadvantaged. Second point then on how we address social injustices. This is where most of CNI's case comes from. Firstly, they said that we allow racist rhetoric on our side and stigma and that they reduce this. We told you from second and third that yes, we do have stigma on our side, but we have significantly less than what they do. Because what happens with them is when you give money all completely to an iwi, there's favoritism towards that iwi. That's how racists view it. But at our side, we're giving it to the benefit in general. And so it's to people who are both Māori and Pākehā, but the majority is Māori, so we affect them first. But we get significantly less than them on that way. But also we'd like to say that we had no mechanisms from them on how they changed the view of racists on their side. Other than that, they said that Jacinda would stand up and solve racism. But we said that these people would probably be not sympathetic towards her and not listen to her because they see her as a sympathizer to these Māori people who they don't like. So generally, we don't solve racism on their side. Finally, then they said that we don't correct history, but we told you it's just easy for a racist person to just dismiss the past. They have strong views. They're never going to change on their side how a racist person views these Māori people, these Aboriginal people. They didn't give us mechanisms. At the end of this, we understand we have less stigma on our side, and therefore the racism point doesn't stand in today's debate. Finally then, what have we told you that we barely got response to in today's debate? We told you that the government itself is able to improve these minorities and help them more than if they just gave that money straight to iwis. And we told you it's because they just have better infrastructure. When you are giving out the benefit, first you state that you're giving $6 million to WINS. Then WINS has to come up with a plan on how to deal with the benefit and show statistics to show that they have reduced unemployment. Therefore, over time, we see that unemployment has either improved or hasn't, and that we can hold accountability to the government for their change. With iwis, they just give that money and we see no accountability. At the end of this, the government has a wider reach to communities on our side of the house. We are able to help these minorities realistically. Thank you.
Thanks for a great debate. Don't cross the floor and shake hands. But you can give each other an ear five or something.
Good job. Yeah. Yes.
We'll ask you all to leave now. Good
job, guys. Good job, guys. Was that your order? I was like,
Yeah.